Brazil is the largest and easternmost country in South America. It is the world's fifth largest country by area and seventh largest by population, with over 203 million people. The government is a federation comprising 26 states and a federal district, which hosts the capital, Brasilia. Its most populous city is São Paulo, followed by Rio de Janeiro. Brazil has the most Portuguese speakers globally and is the only country in the Americas where Portuguese is an official language. Bounded by Atlantic Ocean on the east, Brazil has a coastline of 7,491 kilometers. Covering roughly half of South America's land area, it borders all other countries and territories on the continent except Ecuador and Chile. Brazil encompasses a wide range of tropical and subtropical landscapes and wetlands, savannas, plateaus, and low mountains. It contains most of the Amazon basin, including the world's largest river system and extensive virgin tropical forest. Brazil has a diverse wildlife, various ecological systems, and vast natural resources spanning numerous protected habitats. The country ranks first among 17 megadiverse countries, with its natural heritage being the subject of significant global interest, as environmental degradation through processes such as deforestation directly affects global issues such as climate change and biodiversity loss. Various indigenous peoples inhabited Brazil before Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral landed in 1500. It was claimed and settled by Portugal, which forcibly imported enslaved Africans to work on plantations. Brazil remained a colony until 1815, when it was elevated to the rank of kingdom upon the formation of United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and Algarves after the transfer of the Portuguese court to Rio de Janeiro. Prince Pedro of Braganza declared the country's independence in 1822, establishing the Empire of Brazil, a unitary state governed under a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. Brazil's first constitution in 1824 established a bicameral legislature, now called National Congress, and enshrined principles such as freedom of religion and press, but retained slavery, which gradually abolished throughout the 19th century until final abolition in 1888. Brazil became a presidential republic following a military coup d'état in 1889. An authoritarian military dictatorship emerged in 1964 and ruled until 1985, after which civilian governance resumed. Brazil's current constitution, enacted in 1988, defines it as a democratic federal republic. Brazil is a regional and middle power and rising global power. It is an emerging upper-middle income economy and newly industrialized country, with one of the 10 largest economies in the world in both nominal and PPP terms. The largest economy in Latin America and Southern Hemisphere, and the largest share of wealth in South America. With a complex and highly diversified economy, Brazil is one of the world's major or primary exporters of various agricultural goods, mineral resources, and manufactured products. Due to its rich culture and history, the country ranks 13th in the world by number of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Brazil is a founding member of the United Nations, G20, BRICS, G4, Mercosur, Organization of American States, Organization of Ibero-American States, and Community of Portuguese language countries. It is also an observer state of Arab League and a major non-NATO ally of the United States. Brazil occupies a large area along the eastern coast of South America and includes much of the continent's interior. Sharing land borders with Uruguay to the south, Argentina and Paraguay to the southwest, Bolivia and Peru to the west, Colombia to the northwest, and Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname and French overseas region of French Guiana to the north. It shares a border with every South American country except Ecuador and Chile. The Brazilian territory also encompasses several oceanic archipelagos such as Fernando de Noronha, Rocas Atoll, St. Peter and Paul Rock, and Trindade and Martim Vaz. Its size, relief, climate and natural resources make Brazil geographically diverse. Including its Atlantic islands, Brazil lies between latitudes 6 degrees north and 34 degrees south, and longitudes 28 degrees and 74 degrees west. Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world and third largest in the Americas, with total area of 8,515,767.049 kilometers square, including 55,455 kilometers square of water. North to south, Brazil is also the longest country in the world, spanning 4,395 kilometers from north to south and the only country in the world that has equator and Tropic of Capricorn running through. It spans 4 time zones from UTC-5 comprising the state of Acre and the westernmost portion of Amazonas, to UTC-4 in the western states, to UTC-3 in the eastern states, the national time, and UTC-2 in the Atlantic Islands. The climate of Brazil comprises a wide range of weather conditions across a large area and varied topography, but most of the country is tropical. According to the Köppen system, Brazil hosts 6 major climatic subtypes: desert, equatorial, tropical, semi-arid, oceanic and subtropical. The different climatic conditions produce environments ranging from equatorial rainforests in the north and semi-arid deserts in the northeast, to temperate coniferous forests in the south and tropical savannas in central Brazil. In Brazil, forest cover is around 59% of the total land area, equivalent to 496,619,600 hectares of forest in 2020, down from 588,898,000 hectares in 1990. In 2020, naturally regenerating forest covered 485,396,000 hectares and planted forest covered 11,223,600 hectares. Of the naturally regenerating forest, 44% was reported to be primary forest consisting native tree species with no clearly visible indications of human activity, and 30% of the forest area found within protected areas. For 2015, 56% of the forest area was reported under public ownership and 44% private ownership. Many regions have starkly different microclimates. An equatorial climate characterizes much of northern Brazil. There is no real dry season, but there are some variations in the period of the year when most rain falls. Temperatures average 25 degrees Celsius with more significant temperature variation between night and day than between seasons. Over central Brazil, rainfall is more seasonal, characteristic of a savanna climate. This region is as extensive as the Amazon basin but has a very different climate as it lies farther south at a higher altitude. In the interior northeast, seasonal rainfall is even more extreme. South of Bahia, near the coasts, and more southerly most of the state of São Paulo, the distribution of rainfall changes, with rain falling throughout the year. The south enjoys subtropical conditions, with cool winters and average annual temperatures not exceeding 18 degrees Celsius. Winter frosts and snowfall are not rare in the highest areas. The semi-arid climatic region generally receives less than 800 millimeters of rain, most of which generally falls in a period of 3 to 5 months of the year and occasionally less than this, creating long periods of drought. Brazil's 1877 to 1878 Grande Seca, Great Drought, the worst in Brazil's history, caused 500,000 deaths. A similarly devastating drought occurred in 1915. In 2024, for the first time, drought covered from the north to the country's southeast. It is the strongest drought in Brazil since the beginning of measurement in the 1950s, covering almost 60% of the country's territory. The drought is linked to deforestation and climate change. Brazilian topography is diverse with hills, mountains, plains, highlands, and scrublands. Much of the terrain lies between 200 meters and 800 meters in elevation. The main upland area occupies most of the southern half of the country. The northwestern parts of the plateau consist of broad, rolling terrain broken by low, rounded hills. The southeastern section is more rugged with complex mass of ridges and mountain ranges reaching elevations of up to 1,200 meters. These ranges include Mantiqueira, Espinhaco Mountains, and Serra do Marche. In the north, Guiana Highlands form significant drainage divide, separating rivers that flow south into Amazon basin from rivers that empty into Orinoco River system in Venezuela to the north. Highest point in Brazil is Pico da Neblina at 2,994 meters and lowest is Atlantic Ocean. Brazil has dense and complex system of rivers. One of the world's most extensive with 8 major drainage basins, all of which drain into Atlantic. Major rivers include Amazon, world's second longest river and largest in terms of volume of water, Parana, and its major tributary the Iguacu, which includes Iguazu Falls, Negro, São Francisco, Zinga, Madeira and Tapajós rivers. Wildlife of Brazil comprises all naturally occurring animals, plants, and fungi in South American country. Home to 60% of Amazon rainforest, which accounts for 1/10 of all species in the world, Brazil have the greatest biodiversity of any country on the planet, containing over 70% of all animal and plant species catalogued. Brazil has the most known species of plants, 55,000, freshwater fish, 3,000, and mammals, 689. It also ranks third in the countries with most bird species, 1,832, and second with most reptile species, 744. Number of fungal species is unknown but is significant. Brazil is second only to Indonesia as the country with most endemic species. Brazil's large territory comprises different ecosystems such as Amazon rainforest, recognized as having the greatest biological diversity in the world, with Atlantic forest and Cerrado sustaining the greatest biodiversity. In the south, Araucaria moist forests grow under temperate conditions. The rich wildlife of Brazil reflects the variety of natural habitats. Scientists estimate that total number of plant and animal species in Brazil could approach 4 million, mostly invertebrates. Larger mammals include carnivores, pumas, jaguars, ocelots, rare bush dogs, foxes, herbivores, peccaries, tapirs, anteaters, sloths, opossums, and armadillos. Deer are plentiful in the south, and many species of New World monkeys are found in the northern rainforests. More than 1/5 of Amazon rainforest in Brazil completely destroyed, and more than 70 mammals are endangered. Of the 202 endangered animals in Brazil, 171 are in the Atlantic forest. In 2017, preserved native vegetation occupied 61% of Brazilian territory. Agriculture occupied only 8% of the national territory and pastures 19.7%. For comparison, in 2019, although 43% of the entire European continent has forests, only 3% of the total forest area in Europe is of native forest. Tourism in Brazil is a growing sector and key to the economies of several country regions. The country had 6.36 million visitors in 2015, ranking in terms of international tourist arrivals as the main destination in South America and second in Latin America after Mexico. Historical records of 5.4 million visitors and $6.8 billion in receipts reached in 2011. In the list of world tourist destinations in 2018, Brazil was 48th most visited country with 6.6 million tourists. Natural areas are the most popular tourism product, combining ecotourism with leisure and recreation, mainly sun and beach, adventure travel and cultural tourism. Among the most popular destinations are Amazon rainforest, beaches and dunes in Northeast region, Pantanal in Center-West region, beaches at Rio de Janeiro and Santa Catarina, cultural tourism in Minas Gerais and business trips to São Paulo. In terms of 2015 Travel and Tourism Competitiveness Index, which measures factors that are attractive to develop business in travel and tourism industry of individual countries, Brazil ranked 28th place at the world's level, third in the Americas, after Canada and the United States. Domestic tourism is a key market segment for the tourism industry in Brazil. In 2005, 51 million Brazilian nationals made 10 times more trips than foreign tourists and spent 5 times more money than their international counterparts. The main destination states in 2023 were São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro and Rio Grande do Sul. The main source of tourists for the entire country is São Paulo state. In terms of tourism revenues, the top earners by state were São Paulo and Bahia. For 2005, the 3 main trip purposes were visiting friends and family, 53.1%, sun and beach, 40.8%, and cultural tourism, 12.5%. The Brazilian Space Agency has the most advanced space program in Latin America, with significant resources to launch vehicles and manufacture of satellites. The country develops submarines and aircraft as well as involved in space research, having a vehicle launch satellite and being the only country in the Southern Hemisphere to integrate a team building the well-known International Space Station. The country is also pioneer in the search for oil in deep water, from where it extracts 73% of its reserves. Uranium is enriched at Resende Nuclear Fuel Factory, mostly for research purposes, as Brazil obtains 88% of its electricity from hydroelectricity, and the country's first nuclear submarine is expected to be launched in 2029. Brazil is one of the 3 countries in Latin America with an operational synchrotron laboratory, a research facility on physics, chemistry, material science, and life sciences. Brazil is the only Latin American country with a semiconductor company with its fabrication plant, the CTEC. According to Global Information Technology Report 2009-2010 of the World Economic Forum, Brazil is the world's 61st largest developer of information technology. Brazil was ranked 50th in Global Innovation Index in 2024, up from 66th in 2019. Brazil is the world's 9th largest energy consumer. Much of its energy comes from renewable sources, particularly hydroelectricity and ethanol. Itaipu Dam is the world's largest hydroelectric plant by energy generation, and the country has other large plants such as Belo Monte and Tucuruí. The first car with an ethanol engine was produced in 1978 and the first airplane engine running on ethanol in 2005. At the end of 2021, Brazil was the 2nd country in the world in terms of installed hydroelectric power and biomass. 7th country in the world in terms of installed wind power and 14th country in the world in terms of installed solar power, on track to become one of the top 10 in the world in solar energy. At the end of 2021, Brazil was 4th largest producer of wind energy in the world, behind China, United States, and Germany, and 11th largest producer of solar energy in the world. As for oil, Brazilian government embarked on program over the decades to reduce dependence on imported oil, which previously accounted for more than 70% of the country's oil needs. Brazil became self-sufficient in oil in 2006 to 2007. In 2021, the country closed the year as 7th oil producer in the world with average of close to 3 million barrels per day, becoming exporter of the product. Brazilian roads are primary carriers of freight and passenger traffic. The road system totaled 1,720,000 kilometers in 2019. Total paved roads increased from 35,496 kilometers in 1967 to 215,000 kilometers in 2018. Brazil's railway system has declined since 1945, when emphasis shifted to highway construction. The country's total railway track length was 30,576 kilometers in 2015 as compared with 31,848 kilometers in 1970, making it the 9th largest network in the world. Most of the railway system belonged to Federal Railroad Network Corporation, which was privatized in 2007. São Paulo Metro began operating on the 14th of September, 1974 as first underground transit system in Brazil. There are about 2,500 airports in Brazil, including landing fields. The 2nd largest number in the world, after the United States. São Paulo Garelhos International Airport, near São Paulo, is the largest and busiest airport with nearly 43 million passengers annually, while handling the vast majority of commercial traffic for the country. For freight transport, waterways are of importance. The industrial zones of Manaus can be reached only using Solimo's Amazonas waterway. The country also has 50,000 kilometers of waterways. Coastal shipping links widely separated parts of the country. Bolivia and Paraguay have been given free ports at Santos. Of the 36 deepwater ports, Santos, Itajaí, Rio Grande, Paranagua, Rio de Janeiro, Sepetiba, Vitoria, Suape, Manaus, and São Francisco do Sul are the most important. Bulk carriers must wait up to 18 days before being serviced. On average, container ships take 36 hours. According to latest official projection, it is estimated that Brazil's population was 210,862,983 on the 1st of July, 2022. According to 2022 Brazilian census, 45.3% of the population, 92.1 million, described themselves as pardo, meaning brown or mixed, 43.5%, 88.2 million, as white, 10.2%, 27 million, as black, 0.6%, 1.2 million, as indigenous and 0.4%, 850,000, as East Asian, officially called yellow or amarela. From the 19th century, Brazil opened its borders to immigration. About 5 million people from over 60 countries migrated to Brazil between 1808 and 1972, most of them of Portuguese, Italian, Spanish, German, English, Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish, African, Armenian, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean and Arab origin. Brazil has second largest Jewish community in both Latin and South America after Argentina, making up 0.06% of its population. Outside of Arab world, Brazil also has the largest population of Arab ancestry in the world, with 15 to 20 million people. According to Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Brazil is home to Lebanese diaspora of 7 to 10 million, surpassing the population of Lebanese individuals residing in Lebanon. Brazilian society is more markedly divided by social class lines, although high income disparity found between race groups. So racism and classism often overlap. The brown population, officially called Pardo in Portuguese, also colloquially Moreno, is a broad category that includes caboclos, assimilated Amerindians in general and descendants of whites and natives, mulattoes, descendants of primarily whites and Afro-Brazilians, and Cafuzos, descendants of Afro-Brazilians and natives. Higher percents of blacks, mulattoes, and triracials found in eastern coast of northeastern region from Bahia to Paraíba and also in northern Maranhão, southern Minas Gerais and eastern Rio de Janeiro. People of considerable Amerindian ancestry form the majority of the population in the northern, northeastern, and center-western regions. In 2007, National Indian Foundation estimated that Brazil has 67 different uncontacted tribes, up from their estimate of 40 in 2005. Brazil is believed to have the largest number of uncontacted peoples in the world. Christianity is the country's predominant faith, with Roman Catholicism being largest denomination. Brazil has the world's largest Catholic population. Official language of Brazil is Portuguese, which almost all of the population speaks, and virtually the only language used in newspapers, radio, television, and for business and administrative purposes. Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking nation in the Americas, making the language an important part of Brazilian national identity and giving it a national culture distinct from those of its Spanish-speaking neighbors. Core culture of Brazil is derived from Portuguese culture because of its strong colonial ties with Portuguese Empire. Among other influences, Portuguese introduced Portuguese language, Roman Catholicism, and colonial architectural styles. The culture was also strongly influenced by African, indigenous, and non-Portuguese European cultures and traditions. Some aspects of Brazilian culture were influenced by the contributions of Italian, German, and other European as well as Japanese, Jewish, and Arab immigrants who arrived in large numbers in the south and southeast of Brazil during the 19th and 20th centuries. The indigenous Amerindians influenced Brazil's language and cuisine, and the Africans influenced language, cuisine, music, dance, and religion. Brazilian art developed since 16th century into different styles that range from Baroque, dominant style in Brazil, until the early 19th century, to Romanticism, Modernism, Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, and Abstractionism. Brazilian cinema dates back to the birth of the medium in the late 19th century, has gained a new level of international acclaim since the 1960s. The architecture of Brazil is influenced by Europe, especially Portugal. It has a history that goes back 500 years to the time when Pedro Álvares Cabral landed in Brazil in 1500. Portuguese colonial architecture was the first wave of architecture to go to Brazil, 456. It is the basis for all Brazilian architecture of later centuries. In the 19th century, during the time of the Empire of Brazil, the country followed European trends and adopted neoclassical and Gothic revival architecture. Then, in the 20th century, especially in Brasilia, Brazil experimented with modernist architecture. The colonial architecture of Brazil dates to the early 16th century, when Brazil was first explored, conquered, and settled by the Portuguese. The Portuguese built architecture familiar to them in Europe in their aim to colonize Brazil. They built Portuguese colonial architecture, which included churches and civic architecture, including houses and forts, in Brazilian cities and the countryside. During the 19th century, Brazilian architecture saw the introduction of more European styles to Brazil, such as neoclassical and Gothic revival architecture. This was usually mixed with Brazilian influences from their own heritage. In the 1950s, modernist architecture was introduced when Brasilia was built as a new federal capital in the interior of Brazil to help develop the interior. The architect Oscar Niemeyer idealized and built government buildings, churches, and civic buildings in the modernist style. Brazilian cuisine varies greatly by region, reflecting the country's varying mix of indigenous and immigrant populations. This has created a national cuisine marked by the preservation of regional differences. 496 examples of feijoada, considered the country's national dish winking sad smiley. 497, and regional foods such as beiju, feijão tropeiro, vatapá, moqueca, polenta, from Italian cuisine, and acarajé, from African cuisine. 498, the national beverage is coffee. Cachaça is Brazil's native liquor. Cachaça is distilled from sugarcane and is the main ingredient in the national cocktail, caipirinha. 499. A typical meal consists mostly of rice and beans with beef, salad, French fries, and a fried egg. 500. Often, it is mixed with cassava flour, farofa. Fried potatoes, fried cassava, fried banana, fried meat and fried cheese are very often eaten in lunch and served in most typical restaurants. 501. Popular snacks are pastel, a fried pastry, coccinha, a variation of chicken croquet, powder queijo, cheese bread and cassava flour tapioca, pamonia, corn and milk paste, esfera, a variation of Lebanese pastry, kibbeh, from Arabic cuisine, empanada, pastry, and empada, little salt pies filled with shrimps or heart of palm. Brazil has a variety of desserts such as brigadeiros, chocolate fudge balls, bolo de rolo, roll cake with garabada, cocada, a coconut sweet, beijinhos, coconut truffles and clove, and Romeu e Julieta, cheese with garabada. Peanuts are used to make pacoca, rapadura, and pié de molek. Local common fruits such as acai, cupuaçu, mango, papaya, cocoa, cashew, guava, orange, lime, passion fruit, pineapple, and hog plum are turned in juices and used to make chocolates, ice pops and ice cream. Some of the earliest human remains found in the Americas, Luzia woman, were found in the area of Pedro Leopoldo, Minas Gerais, and provide evidence of human habitation going back at least 11,000 years. The earliest pottery ever found in the Western Hemisphere was excavated in the Amazon basin of Brazil, and radiocarbon dated to 8,000 years ago, 1600 BC. The pottery was found near Santarém and provides evidence that the region supported a complex prehistoric culture. 43. The Marajora culture flourished on Marajo in the Amazon Delta from AD 400 to 1400, developing sophisticated pottery, social stratification, large populations, mound building, and complex social formations such as chiefdoms. Around the time of the Portuguese arrival, the territory of current-day Brazil had an estimated indigenous population of 7 million people, mostly semi-nomadic, who subsisted on hunting, fishing, gathering, and migrant agriculture. The population comprised several large indigenous ethnic groups: Tupis, Guaranis, Jez, and Arawaks. The Tupi people were subdivided into the Tupiniquins and Tupinambas. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the boundaries between these groups and their subgroups were marked by wars that arose from differences in culture, language, and moral beliefs. These wars also involved large-scale military actions on land and water, with cannibalistic rituals on prisoners of war. While heredity had some weight, leadership was a status more won over time than assigned in succession ceremonies and conventions. Slavery among the indigenous groups had a different meaning than it had for Europeans, since it originated from a diverse socio-economic organization in which asymmetries were translated into kinship relations. Following the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, the land now called Brazil was claimed for the Portuguese Empire on the 22nd of April, 1500, with the arrival of the Portuguese fleet commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral, 52. The Portuguese encountered indigenous peoples divided into several ethnic societies, most of whom spoke languages of the Tupi-Guarani family and fought among themselves. 53. Though the first settlement was founded in 1532, colonization effectively began in 1534, when King John III of Portugal divided the territory into the 15 private and autonomous captaincies. However, the decentralized and unorganized tendencies of the captaincies proved problematic, and in 1549 the Portuguese king restructured them into the Governorate-General of Brazil in the city of Salvador, which became the capital of a single and centralized Portuguese colony in South America. 55, 56. In the first 2 centuries of colonization, indigenous and European groups lived in constant war, establishing opportunistic alliances in order to gain advantages against each other. By the mid-16th century, cane sugar had become Brazil's most important export, while slaves purchased in sub-Saharan Africa in the slave market of Western Africa, not only those from Portuguese allies of their colonies in Angola and Mozambique, had become its largest import. To cope with sugarcane plantations, due to increasing international demand for Brazilian sugar, Brazil received more than 2.8 million slaves from Africa between the years 1500 and 1800. By the end of the 17th century, sugarcane exports began to decline, 68, and the discovery of gold by Bandeirantes in the 1690s would become the new backbone of the colony's economy, fostering a gold rush, 69, which attracted thousands of new settlers to Brazil from Portugal and all Portuguese colonies around the world. This increased level of immigration in turn caused some conflicts between newcomers and old settlers. Portuguese expeditions known as bandeiras gradually expanded Brazil's original colonial frontiers in South America to its approximately current borders. In this era, other European powers tried to colonize parts of Brazil, in incursions that the Portuguese had to fight, notably the French in Rio during the 1560s, in Maranhão during the 1610s, and the Dutch in Bahia and Pernambuco during the Dutch-Portuguese War, after the end of Iberian Union. The Portuguese colonial administration in Brazil had two objectives that would ensure colonial order and the monopoly of Portugal's wealthiest and largest colony: to keep under control and eradicate all forms of slave rebellion and resistance, such as the Quilombo of Palmares, and to repress all movements for autonomy or independence, such as the Minas Gerais conspiracy. In late 1807, Spanish and Napoleonic forces threatened the security of continental Portugal, causing Prince Regent John, in the name of Queen Maria I, to move the royal court from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro. There they established some of Brazil's first financial institutions such as local stock exchange and national bank, additionally ending the Portuguese monopoly on Brazilian trade and opening Brazil's ports to other nations. In 1809, in retaliation for being forced into exile, Prince Regent ordered the conquest of French Guiana. With the end of Peninsular War in 1814, the courts of Europe demanded that Queen Maria I and Prince Regent John return to Portugal, deeming it unfit for the head of an ancient European monarchy to reside in a colony. In 1815, to justify continuing to live in Brazil, where the royal court had thrived for 6 years, the Crown established United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and Algarves, thus creating pluricontinental transatlantic monarchic state. However, the leadership in Portugal, resentful of the new status of its larger colony, continued to demand the return of the court to Lisbon. In 1821, acceding to the demands of revolutionaries who had taken the city of Porto, John VI departed for Lisbon. There he swore an oath to the new constitution, leaving his son, Prince Pedro de Alcantara, as regent of the Kingdom of Brazil. Tensions between Portuguese and Brazilians increased, and the Portuguese Cortes, guided by the new political regime imposed by the Liberal Revolution, tried to re-establish Brazil as a colony. The Brazilians refused to yield, and Prince Pedro decided to stand with them, declaring the country's independence from Portugal on the 7th of September, 1822. A month later, Prince Pedro was declared the first emperor of Brazil, with the royal title of Dom Pedro I, resulting in the founding of the Empire of Brazil. The Brazilian War of Independence, which had already begun along this process, spread through the northern, northeastern regions and in the Cisplatina province. The last Portuguese soldiers surrendered on the 8th of March, 1824. Portugal officially recognized Brazilian independence on the 29th of August, 1825. On the 7th of April, 1831, worn down by years of administrative turmoil and political dissent with both liberal and conservative sides of politics, including an attempt of republican secession and unreconciled to the way that absolutists in Portugal had given in the succession of King John VI, Pedro I departed for Portugal to reclaim his daughter's crown after abdicating the Brazilian throne in favor of his 5-year-old son and heir, Dom Pedro II. As the new emperor could not exert his constitutional powers until he came of age, a regency was set up by the National Assembly. In the absence of a charismatic figure who could represent a moderate face of power, during this period a series of localized rebellions took place, such as the Cabanagem in Grão-Pará, the Male Revolt in Salvador, the Balaiada, Maranhão, the Sabinada, Bahia, and the Ragamuffin War, which began in Rio Grande do Sul and was supported by Giuseppe Garibaldi. These emerged from the province's dissatisfaction with the central power, coupled with old and latent social tensions peculiar to a vast, slaveholding and newly independent nation-state. This period of internal political and social upheaval, which included the Priera revolt in Pernambuco, was overcome only at the end of the 1840s, years after the end of the Regency, which occurred with the premature coronation of Pedro II in 1841. During the last phase of the monarchy, internal political debate centered on the issue of slavery. The Atlantic slave trade was abandoned in 1850, as a result of the British Aberdeen Act and the Eusebio de Queiroz Law, but only in May 1888, after a long process of internal mobilization and debate for an ethical and legal dismantling of slavery in the country, was the institution formally abolished with the approval of the Golden Law. The foreign affairs policies of the monarchy dealt with issues with the countries of the Southern Cone with whom Brazil had borders. Long after the Cisplatin War that resulted in the independence of Uruguay, Brazil won 3 international wars during the 58-year reign of Pedro II. The Platine War, the Uruguayan War and the devastating Paraguayan War, the largest war effort in Brazilian history. Although there was no desire among the majority of Brazilians to change the country's form of government, on the 15th of November, 1889, in disagreement with the majority of the Imperial Army officers, as well as with rural and financial elites, for different reasons, the monarchy was overthrown by a military coup. A few days later, the national flag was replaced with a new design that included the national motto Order Mi Progresso, influenced by positivism. The 15th of November is now Republic Day, a national holiday. The early Republican government was a military dictatorship, with the army dominating affairs both in Rio de Janeiro and in the States. Freedom of the press disappeared and elections were controlled by those in power. Not until 1894, following an economic crisis and a military one, did civilians take power, remaining there until October 1930. In relation to its foreign policy, the country in this first Republican period maintained a relative balance characterized by a success in resolving border disputes with neighboring countries, only broken by the Acre War, 1899 to 1902, and its involvement in World War I, 1914 to 1918, followed by a failed attempt to exert a prominent role in the League of Nations. Internally, from the crisis of Ensilamento and the Navy revolts, a prolonged cycle of financial, political and social instability began until the 1920s, keeping the country besieged by various rebellions, both civilian and military. Little by little, a cycle of general instability sparked by these crises undermined the regime to such an extent that in the wake of the murder of his running mate, the defeated opposition presidential candidate Getulio Vargas, supported by most of the military, successfully led the revolution of 1930. Vargas and the military were supposed to assume power temporarily, but instead closed down Congress, extinguished the Constitution, ruled with emergency powers and replaced the state's governors with his own supporters. In the 1930s, 3 attempts to remove Vargas and his supporters from power failed. The first was the Constitutionalist Revolution in 1932, led by São Paulo's oligarchy. The second was a communist uprising in November 1935, and the last one a putsch attempt by local fascists in May 1938. The 1935 uprising created a security crisis in which Congress transferred more power to the executive branch. The 1937 coup d'état resulted in the cancellation of the 1938 election and formalized Vargas as dictator, beginning the Estado Novo era. During this period, government brutality and censorship of the press increased. During World War II, Brazil remained neutral until August 1942, when the country suffered retaliation by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in a strategic dispute over the South Atlantic, and, therefore, entered the war on the Allied side. In addition to its participation in the Battle of the Atlantic, Brazil also sent an expeditionary force to fight in the Italian campaign. With the Allied victory in 1945 and the end of the fascist regimes in Europe, Vargas's position became unsustainable, and he was swiftly overthrown in another military coup, with democracy reinstated by the same army that had ended it 15 years earlier. 133. Vargas committed suicide in August 1954 amid a political crisis, after having returned to power by election in 1950. Several brief interim governments followed Vargas's suicide. Juscelino Kubitschek became president in 1956 and assumed a conciliatory posture towards the political opposition that allowed him to govern without major crises. The economy and industrial sector grew remarkably, but his greatest achievement was the construction of the new capital city of Brasilia, inaugurated in 1960. Kubitschek's successor, Janeiro Quadros, resigned in 1961, less than a year after taking office. His vice president, João Goulart, assumed the presidency, but aroused strong political opposition and was deposed in April 1964 by a coup that resulted in a military dictatorship. The new regime was intended to be transitory but gradually closed in on itself and became a full dictatorship with the promulgation of the Fifth Institutional Act in 1968. Oppression was not limited to those who resorted to guerrilla tactics to fight the regime, but also reached institutional opponents, artists, journalists, and other members of civil society, inside and outside the country through the infamous Operation Condor. Like other brutal authoritarian regimes, due to an economic boom, known as the economic miracle, the regime reached a peak in popularity in the early 1970s. Slowly, however, the wear and tear of years of dictatorial power had not slowed the repression, even after the defeat of the leftist guerrillas. The inability to deal with the economic crises of the period and popular pressure made an opening policy inevitable, which from the regime side was led by Generals Ernesto Geisel and Golbery do Couto e Silva. With the enactment of the amnesty law in 1979, Brazil began a slow return to democracy, which was completed during the 1980s. Ulysses Guimarães holding the Constitution of 1988. Civilians returned to power in 1985 when José Sarney assumed the presidency. He became unpopular during his tenure through failure to control the economic crisis and hyperinflation he inherited from the military regime. Sarney's unsuccessful government led to the election in 1989 of the almost unknown Fernando Collor, who was subsequently impeached by the National Congress in 1992. Collor was succeeded by his vice president, Itamar Franco, who appointed Fernando Henrique Cardoso Minister of Finance. In 1994, Cardoso produced a highly successful Plano Real that, after decades of failed economic plans made by previous governments attempting to curb hyperinflation, finally stabilized the Brazilian economy. Cardoso won the 1994 election, and again in 1998. The peaceful transition of power from Cardoso to his main opposition leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, elected in 2002 and re-elected in 2006, was seen as proof that Brazil had achieved a long-sought political stability. However, sparked by indignation and frustrations accumulated over decades from corruption, police brutality, inefficiencies of the political establishment and public service, numerous peaceful protests erupted in Brazil in the middle of the first term of Dilma Rousseff, who had succeeded Lula after winning election in 2010 and again in 2014 by narrow margins. Rousseff was impeached by the Brazilian Congress in 2016, halfway into her second term, and replaced by her vice president Michel Temer, who assumed full presidential powers after Rousseff's impeachment was accepted on the 31st of August. Large street protests for and against her took place during the impeachment process. The charges against her were fueled by political and economic crises, along with evidence of involvement with politicians from all the primary political parties. In 2017, the Supreme Court requested the investigation of 71 Brazilian lawmakers and 9 ministers of President Michel Temer's cabinet who were allegedly linked to the Petrobras corruption scandal. 165. President Temer himself was also accused of corruption. According to a 2018 poll, 62% of the population said that corruption was Brazil's biggest problem. In the fiercely disputed 2018 elections, the controversial conservative candidate Jair Bolsonaro of the Social Liberal Party was elected president, winning in the second round against Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party with the support of 55.13% of the valid votes. In May 2021, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva stated that he would run for a third term in the 2022 Brazilian general election against Bolsonaro. In October 2022, Lula was in first place in the first round, with 48.43% of the support from the electorate, and received 50.9% of the votes in the second round. On the 8th of January, 2023, a week after Lula's inauguration, a mob of Bolsonaro's supporters attacked Brazil's federal government buildings in the capital, Brasilia, after several weeks of unrest. Brazil is a developing country with an upper-middle income mixed market economy that is rich in natural resources. It has the largest national economy in Latin America, the 8th largest economy in the world by nominal GDP and the 8th largest by PPP. After rapid growth in preceding decades, Brazil entered ongoing recession in 2014 amid a political corruption scandal and nationwide protests. In 2024, the economy began showing consistent, significant growth. Brazil has a labor force of roughly 100 million, which is the world's 5th largest, albeit with a high unemployment rate of 14.4% as of 2021. Its foreign exchange reserves are the 10th highest in the world. The B3 in São Paulo is the largest stock exchange of Latin America by market capitalization. Roughly 1/5 of Brazilians live in poverty. Brazil's economy suffers from endemic corruption and high income inequality. The Brazilian real is the national currency. Brazil's diversified economy includes agriculture, industry, and a wide range of services. The large service sector accounts for about 72.7% of total GDP, followed by the industrial sector, 20.7%, while the agriculture sector is by far the smallest, making up 6.6% of total GDP. Brazil is one of the largest producers of various agricultural commodities and also has a large cooperative sector that provides 50% of the food in the country. It has been the world's largest producer of coffee for the last 150 years and is the world's largest producer of sugarcane, soy, coffee, and orange. It is one of the top 5 producers of maize, cotton, lemon, tobacco, pineapple, banana, beans, coconut, watermelon and papaya, and one of the top 10 world producers of cocoa, cashew, mango, rice, tomato, sorghum, tangerine, avocado, persimmon, and guava. Regarding livestock, it is one of the 5 largest producers of chicken meat, beef, pork, and cow's milk in the world. In the mining sector, Brazil is among the largest producers of iron ore, copper, gold, bauxite, manganese, tin, niobium, and nickel. In terms of precious stones, Brazil is the world's largest producer of amethyst, topaz, agate, and one of the main producers of tourmaline, emerald, aquamarine, garnet, and opal. The country is a major exporter of soy, iron ore, pulp, cellulose, maize, beef, chicken meat, soybean meal, sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton, orange juice, footwear, airplanes, cars, vehicle parts, gold, ethanol, and semi-finished iron, among other products. Its automotive industry is the 8th largest in the world. In the food industry, Brazil was the 2nd largest exporter of processed foods in the world in 2019. The country was the 2nd largest producer of pulp in the world and the 8th largest producer of paper in 2016. In the footwear industry, Brazil was the 4th largest producer in 2019. It was also the 9th largest producer of steel in the world. In 2018, the chemical industry of Brazil was the 8th largest in the world. Although it was among the 5 largest world producers in 2013, Brazil's textile industry is very little integrated into world trade. Brazil is the world's 24th largest exporter and 26th largest importer as of 2021. The most popular sport in Brazil is football. The Brazilian men's national team is ranked among the best in the world according to the FIFA World Rankings, and has won the World Cup tournament a record 5 times. Volleyball, basketball, auto racing, and martial arts also has large audiences. The Brazil men's national volleyball team, for example, currently holds the titles of the World League, World Grand Champions Cup, World Championship, and the World Cup. In auto racing, 3 Brazilian drivers have won the Formula 1 World Championship 8 times, 518, 519, 520. The country has also produced significant achievements in other sports such as sailing, swimming, tennis, surfing, skateboarding, MMA, gymnastics, boxing, judo, athletics, and table tennis. Some sport variations have their origins in Brazil. Beach football, futsal, indoor football, and foot volley emerged in Brazil as variations of football. In martial arts, Brazilians developed capoeira, vale tudo, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Brazil has hosted several high-profile international sporting events, such as the 1950 FIFA World Cup, and recently has hosted the 2014 FIFA World Cup, 2019 Copa America and 2021 Copa America. The São Paulo circuit, Autódromo José Carlos Pace, hosts the annual Grand Prix of Brazil. São Paulo organized the 4 Pan American Games in 1963, and Rio de Janeiro hosted the 15 Pan American Games in 2007. On the 2nd of October, 2009, Rio de Janeiro was selected to host the 2016 Olympic Games and 2016 Paralympic Games, making it the first South American city to host the Games and second in Latin America, after Mexico City. Furthermore, the country hosted the FIBA Basketball World Cups in 1954 and 1963. At the 1963 event, the Brazil national basketball team won one of its 2 world championship titles. The theatre in Brazil has its origins in the period of Jesuit expansion, when theatre was used for the dissemination of Catholic doctrine in the 16th century. In the 17th and 18th centuries, dramatists on the scene of European derivation were for court or private performances. During the 19th century, the playwrights Antonio Goncalves Dias and Luis Carlos Martins Pina were known for their performance. There were also numerous operas and orchestras. The Brazilian conductor Antonio Carlos Gomes became internationally known with operas such as Illinois Guarani. At the end of the 19th century, orchestrated dramaturgias were accompanied with songs of famous artists such as the conductress Chiquinha Gonzaga. Already in the early 20th century there was the presence of theatres, entrepreneurs, and actor companies. In 1940, Pascal Carlos Magno and his Students' Theatre, the Comedians Group, and the Italian actors Adolfo Celi, Ruggero Jacobi, and Aldo Calvo, founders of the Teatro Brasileiro de Comédia, renewed the Brazilian theatre. From the 1960s, it was attended by a theatre dedicated to social and religious issues. The most prominent authors at this stage were Jorge Andrade and Ariano Suassuna. Brazilian painting emerged in the late 16th century, influenced by Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassicism, Romanticism, Realism, Modernism, Expressionism, Surrealism, Cubism, and Abstractionism, making it a major art style called Brazilian academic art. The French artistic mission arrived in Brazil in 1816, proposing the creation of an art academy modeled after the respected Académie des Beaux-Arts, with graduation courses both for artists and craftsmen for activities such as modeling, decorating, carpentry and others, and bringing artists such as Jean-Baptiste Debret. Upon the creation of the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts, new artistic movements spread across the country during the 19th century, and later the event called Modern Art Week broke with academic tradition in 1922 and started a nationalist trend which was influenced by modernist arts. The music of Brazil was formed mainly from the fusion of European, native indigenous, and African elements. Until the 19th century, Portugal was the gateway to most of the influences that built Brazilian music, although many of these elements were not of Portuguese origin, but generally European. The first was José Mauricio Nunes Garcia, author of sacred pieces with an influence of Viennese classicism. The major contribution of the African element was the rhythmic diversity and some dances and instruments. Popular music since the late 18th century, samba was considered the most typical and on the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List. Samba reggae, maracatu, frevo, and a fox are 4 music traditions that have been popularized by their appearance in the annual Brazilian carnivals. Capoeira is usually played with its own music referred to as capoeira music, which is usually considered to be a call and response type of folk music. Forró is a type of folk music prominent during the Festa Junina in northeastern Brazil. 465, Jack A. Draper III, a professor of Portuguese at the University of Missouri, argues that forró was used as a way to subdue feelings of nostalgia for a rural lifestyle. Choro is a popular musical instrumental style. Its origins are in 19th century Rio de Janeiro. The style often has a fast and happy rhythm, characterized by subtle modulations and full of syncopation and counterpoint. 468, Bossa Nova is also a well-known style of Brazilian music developed and popularized in the 1950s and 1960s. The phrase bossa nova means literally new trend. A lyrical fusion of samba and jazz, bossa nova acquired a large following starting in the 1960s. Some international Brazilian music artists are, for example, Villa-Lobos, Tom Jobim, João Gilberto, Sergio Mendes, Yuma Deodato, Calma, Sepultura, Alodum, and CSS. Brazilian topography is also diverse and includes hills, mountains, plains, highlands, and scrublands. Much of the terrain lies between 200 meters and 800 meters in elevation. The main upland area occupies most of the southern half of the country. The northwestern parts of the plateau consist of broad, rolling terrain broken by low, rounded hills. The southeastern section is more rugged, with a complex mass of ridges and mountain ranges reaching elevations of up to 1,200 meters. These ranges include the Mantiqueira and Espinhaco Mountains and the Serra do March. In the north, the Guiana Highlands form a major drainage divide, separating rivers that flow south into the Amazon basin from rivers that empty into the Orinoco River system, in Venezuela, to the north. The highest point in Brazil is the Pico da Neblina at 2,994 meters, and the lowest is the Atlantic Ocean. Brazil has a dense and complex system of rivers, one of the world's most extensive, with 8 major drainage basins, all of which drain into the Atlantic. Major rivers include the Amazon, the world's second longest river and the largest in terms of volume of water, the Parana and its major tributary the Iguaçu, which includes the Iguazu Falls, the Negro, São Francisco, Zinga, Madeira and Tapajós rivers.